Greetings and welcome to the Creative Writing Wizard podcast, where we chat with published authors, writers, to hear more about the people behind the stories. We dig into the books for deeper appreciation and learn from the writing process to become better writers ourselves. Today, I am joined by Kay Starling. Welcome, Kay, to the podcast.
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for asking. It's great to finally meet you.
Yeah, it's great to meet you too.
Yeah, and so for those listening in, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, what you're working on at the moment, and why you're excited about it?
Sure. So I'm actually kind of new to the author world. I published my first book last July, so not been around very long. Did a little ghostwriting before that and some other writing, but as far as publishing, new to this world and excited to be a part of it. My current project is getting my second novel out. It drops in the mail this week. And then it releases next week. So I am frantically trying to get everything uploaded to everywhere.
Yeah, I always feel kind of bad asking for people to join the podcast in and around the time of release because it's I haven't published anything yet, but from what I hear, it's there's quite the number of things and hoops and such to go through to finally get that book out into publication. Hey.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a lot of work, just especially because I go with the broad method. So I'm listing it on Kobo, on Barnes and Noble. It has to get on Ingram Spark. It has to get on Amazon. And then I have my own. So I have everything. All of them are a little particular. Ingram has some particularities that Amazon doesn't have, and they're all kind of like temperamental children, and you need to make sure that you have everything correct for just that site, and then you have to do it again for the next one.
Yeah, and you mentioned going wide. That might be a new term to some people, so can you explain a little bit about what that means in this context?
Sure. So there's kind of two methods that indie authors will often employ. There's either you go straight through Amazon, you're going to use the Kindle Unlimited, and that's where you're going to put everything. And that can be great for some people. I actually didn't find it was great for me. I did for a season take my books off of other sites and just go straight Kindle Unlimited, and I didn't find it helpful. So the going wide method is where you distribute to all of the different places an indie author can distribute. Because if you choose to go Kindle Unlimited, I think it's for 90 days. You can't distribute digitally anywhere else. And so I instead I will have it on Barnes & Noble, on Kobo, on Ingram Spark, which Ingram distributes out to a lot of places like Apple. And now bookshop.org will soon be doing ebooks, so then it can go through them as well. It's just a method that I think is better for me. I prefer it. It's also nice because it helps with a lot of international distribution too. And yeah, it works better for my sales personally. So
awesome. Well, I'm glad that you found something that works because I definitely hear a number of authors trying to navigate that question of whether or not they should go wide or not. So I appreciate that additional insight. You did mention a little bit that you have done some ghostwriting in the past, and I note in the Meet the Authors section of your book, you mentioned after 20 years of writing articles, novels, and blogs for organizations and clients. Can you talk a little bit about your past writing experience and how that led to shifting into wanting to write your own book?
Sure, absolutely. So I kind of got into writing through a funny experience that happened at 17 years old. So my school in my city used to do this thing called Boss for a Day, where local businesses would host juniors and seniors for a day to kind of give them a taste of different industries. And I was editor of the yearbook, and so I got matched with the newspaper. There's a local hometown newspaper, and this is in the days where we still had printed newspapers. And so the person who was in charge of advertising as well as did some work in production, he liked what I did, and he liked your article I wrote for him. I wrote a couple for their newspaper while I was still in high school, and they hired me shortly after high school to work in a production end. And so what was nice is because it was hometown and small, they would allow me to do things like, for instance, they would allow me to write little articles. Sometimes they would send me to go photograph something. And so that's kind of how I got started. I worked through some nonprofit work where I did a lot of article writing, a lot of newsletters, uh, just a lot of communication with our donors. And then eventually, a couple years ago, I decided to give editing a shot and just realized that I was better at writing. And so I decided, well, let's give this ghostwriting thing a shot. And on Upworks, I did about 4 projects. They went pretty well. So there are a few other novels out in the world that are technically written by me that I can never own as my own, but they are written by me and they're out there somewhere in the ethos. Um, and after I got done with I was finishing kind of between 3 and 4. I was like, okay, I'm just going to do it I'm going to do this for myself. And so that's why I sat down and started my own writing. Last year, kind of early in the year, I got started on it.
That's awesome. And it actually came up in a recent podcast about yeah, the question of ghostwriting. So how does that feel to be a ghostwriter? You've written something for someone else. I guess two-part question. What was that process or experience like, and how does it feel to be someone who's written for someone else to fulfill their kind of, mission or vision?
Sure. No, I mean, I think it's kind of an interesting thing. Some people love it. I mean, they literally make a whole career of it. You see that. I think people would be shocked at how much of what they're reading has been written not by the name of the person on the cover. Uh, a lot of your memoirs, um, those are more obvious, but a lot of the things that are coming out now in the romance realm, particularly, uh, might not be written by that author. So that's an interesting thing because I was seeing the job postings and I was potentially could have bid for those. And I chose not to. I don't know if a lot of the big popular ones, but I think some of the smaller ones. But then again, who knows? Because you sign an NDA. What's interesting is there's kind of a two ways. One, the first one, they gave me an outline and they said, this is what you have to write. And there was actually a first book. So I had to try and mimic the first book's style to a certain extent. That was a little challenging, but it was a good practice. So then the last 3 were a series that I did for one person. And that one, they kind of said, do what you like. These are some things we want. We want this era. We want these tropes. Go forth. And so I did. And I really think that helped me kind of create the idea of how to map out a story, how to map out character arcs, I refined a little bit of some of my style. Those don't have quite my style fully in them, but I think if someone read them, they would think, oh, this kind of sounds like her. Uh, yeah. And so that was that good of like, I got to do a lot of work in that. It was interesting though, because you then turn it over and then they can edit it. They can put the cover together. They can do all of those things. And so I try and just let them be out there in the world. But sometimes I do look at the ratings and I was like, oh, I wonder how it's doing.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I feel that's got to be a little bit interesting then, because yeah, if you write a book and then or a piece of work, and then they can like modify that. That's got to be a little tough, hey? Like, because you spent a good amount of time into writing a product, and then someone can then just change it.
Yeah, I know they can. They can just do what they want um, and add things or edit or not edit. So, I mean, I have an editor I work with to make sure that what I finish is, pretty, has been read through, has been fact checked a little, things like that. And they can just release it. And so I'm like, I both enjoy watching them, but I'm also kind of like, oh no, like this isn't fully what I would have put out. Like if I had decided to release that book, I would have done more and different things with it. But I can't, so I'm just like, well, it's out there in the world.
Yeah, and I guess that is one of the positive sides of being now self-published is with your first book and now your second one coming soon. Is that you can write the story, but then you can also decide to do whatever you want with it. You can have your own
Mm-hmm.
cover. You can have, listen to your editor or not. It's kind of up to you. How have you found that experience between your ghostwriting and now you're writing for your own books?
Oh, just such a difference. I love, first of all, like I do a lot of my own cover design. So my covers are my designs. I do bring in another person. I can't do the color part. If you see my colors, there's black silhouettes over watercolor. So I can do the black silhouettes, but I can't do watercolor. And so I bring in someone for that. But I still tell them, I give them what I want in all of the pieces. So I love that I can have creative control in that, and that I have the ability to direct that as much as I do. And I think my covers very much reflect the writing on the inside, because of that. And I love having that control, of deciding whether to listen. I mostly listen to my editor, but her and I have good conversations about how we do the writing style, what the voice should be. That was especially my first one. That took a lot of figuring out. Like, do we go full blown Jane Austen voice, or do we try and find that bridge between modern English and Jane Austen's English? And so that was a lot of conversations. The second book was smoother on that because we already had decided this is the tone, this is the voice, and then now there was other things to work out in the second one.
Those who haven't seen it, definitely check out that cover because I, having worked with a number of authors now, I've seen a range of designs, but like the artwork on your books are like really really good. So that's impressive that you had a pretty significant part of it doing the black portions of it. Um, yeah, and it's cool because like I don't know if this is a spoiler or not, but what I like about the design is that you kind of like drop hints to stuff that's going to happen in the story. What gave you that
Mm-hmm.
idea of introducing elements from the actual story into the cover?
Oh, it just kind of started with the design ideas. So I don't know if any of you have seen, but in the, I think, 70s and 80s, there was this kind, I think it was a harkening back to like Victorian era. There was this style of art that ladies would buy or people could buy. And it was like black and white silhouettes on bubble glass with painting, full color paintings behind. It was usually like a couple or, sort of these things. And I kind of thought, oh, well, that would be fun if we took that, but like, we can't just make it boring. We have to make it a little bit like hints at what's coming. And so, yeah, I did. I started to kind of put little pieces. So, really, within every cover are actual scenes from the book. Some are a little bit of red herrings, but for the most part, the actual scenes from every book are in there. I kind of There's one that's a little bit of a red herring, but no, like there's in my most recent cover, the things on the cover happen in the book, and so if you looked at that, you wouldn't have everything because it's a mystery. So I'm not going to give away everything, but there's enough to be like, oh, okay, this little moment is happening, and for I'm actually redesigning, and soon my first cover will be relaunched to better match the style of the second one because I improved my skill, and so I was like, I need to upgrade this a little bit. So that will be coming out soon. I wanted a little bit more motion. In the first one, they were all kind of standing a little still, and I was like, okay, I now know how to do this better, so I'm going to add a little bit more motion to this.
And yeah, it's really cool because I go into books blind. Like that's my I don't know if that's a
Mm-hmm.
chaotic approach or not. I tend to go into them quite blind. So picking up on the mystery element of these books was a really pleasant surprise. Going into it, I wasn't really sure what to expect, but like the mystery aspect, and then you also mentioned Jane Austen is a fairly big influence. What would you say
Mm-hmm.
are some of the other influences that kind of led to what I feel like is a fairly unique combination of different groupings that I've seen before?
Sure. It all started with I love Jane Austen. I think she had a great social commentary. I think she was a great character author. Like, there, the characters she gave us, I would say her and Dickens are two kind of 1800s character authors who wrote these characters that you just can't forget, and you love to quote because they're fantastic. So there was her, and I thought, I want to write Regency, but I don't want to write romance. Not because romance is bad. I love a good Regency romance, but it's been done. And I was like, well, what if it was a mystery? And then I was sitting down to plot it out, and I was like, but what if there were dragons? And then it was like, well, okay, if there's dragons, I mean, we just got to go for it. Like, now we have to have magic. And then if there's magic, you can have unicorns. And if there's unicorns, that means, and then it just kind of went from there. But some big influences, I think, for me, are the writings of Jasper Fforde. He is an incredible author who is in that playful, ridiculous, but he sometimes tackles some rather heavy content in some of his books. But he also is just a lot of fun to read, very whimsical. I love, her name is escaping me, Jodi Taylor. She wrote the Time Police series. And again, her banter, the Time Police, there are pages where there are no dialogue tags, where it's person, and you know who's talking because she's that good at it. And then I really have recently kind of started to really love the work of Pratchett. And again, creating these kind of off-the-wall worlds, but that work because they work within, they have their own rules, and he sticks within those rules, and they're kind of zany, but he does a good job of that. So those are some of my big influences. And I do, of course, love a Dickens villain or a Dickens side character. They're pretty phenomenal. So,
Indeed. Another thing I liked about your book was how witty it was. I think was the word that I was using as I was thinking about it, especially with the narrator choice. What gave you the idea to have a narrator in that in the story process of having that perspective interjected, throughout the story?
I think it just kind of came natural to almost kind of like lean in and whisper to the reader, like, hey, this is what's really going on. It just felt natural. It also helped a little bit with some of the world building thing, is because she can clarify some things, like there was woolly rhinoceros. So I have woolly rhinoceroses in my book. And an early beta reader said, are they real still? And I was like, okay, we need to clarify that. And so the narrator says, hey, I found out that where you live, they might be extinct, but where we live, they're not. So don't get upset. This is the author note, this is a different world, so move on. And it's just been really nice because you can just say sometimes clarifying points in a very kind of direct way. You can poke fun at the main character. Like there's a point where the main character is worrying about something, and one of the characters says, are you going to sit there and keep wringing your hands? And the main character says, I'm not wringing my hands. And the narrator's like, she was wringing her hands. So, she can kind of be like, this is what's really happening. So it just felt, I think part of my writing process and part of doing these books was I wanted to create something that was fully the thing I wanted to create. And so I just kind of said, well, I don't have to keep these rules. I'm just going to write a story that feels genuine. And part of that was having a narrator with very strong opinions.
It's awesome. Yeah, I definitely thought that it was one of my favorite parts of both book and one and two, was that the comedic element of it was also helpful in a few circumstances, like the one that you mentioned. But I definitely found myself laughing as the characters would talk about something, and then it would be like this short aside of yeah, but. And then you get that narrator inputting a little bit extra detail. I really appreciated that throughout the book, and it wasn't like too much that it was like exposition dumping, but it was enough that it was like, oh, okay, that's an important thing to know, or adding a little witty quirk at the end of a paragraph.
Yeah, I've enjoyed those. And in this one, I use a lot of parentheses. And so as sometimes, even if she's not making a full comment, she'll be like, ugh, this. Or, she there's a lot of that kind of it's a way to communicate an emotion or a feeling without using a lot of extra adverbs and adjectives. It's a way to, if you at the end of the sentence say, curious, that points to the reader like, this is strange, or, so and so was behaving this way. Ugh. Like it says, this is annoying without saying, this is annoying.
The other thing you mentioned about the dragon aspect, you mentioned it fairly early on in book one, the Talisman, Teacups, and Triss, is you talk about the birds versus dragons. So to quote, feathers rather than scales would have prevailed as the embellishment of choice in the fashionable world. And it's just like one line, but it's amazing how in that one line you've communicated a huge amount of change to the world. Um, I guess what was the point at which you were like, you know what, I'm going to put in dragons, and then suddenly it's becoming this fantasy? Because you talked about that was kind of like that was a pivot point for you. Um,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, what's the thought behind that?
I think I just have so loved fantasy, but I think there's a growing place for kind of your cozier fantasies, so not these epic adventures where we're crossing a continent, which those are fun, but people sometimes want fantasy light. They want a little bit of fantasy. They don't need the whole thing, and so that's where I thought it would be fun to bring it in. It's a way to bring in kind of another part of a genre that I enjoy, um, but bring it into a real world that did exist. And always my question is if magic exists, how would that change? Because it's set mostly in 1811. So how would life change in 1811 if magic existed in 1811? And one of them was fashion. Like, if you have dragon scales, then you can have them in your hat. Or some dragons have feathers, and so you could have those in your hat. We have dragons pulling carriages, but not all carriages are pulled by dragons, because not all people would have been able to afford that luxury. And so there is still, most people's carriages and carts are still drawn by horses, because that's what most people could afford. So it's dragons, and their presence is definitely a part of the world, but it is a luxury, and it's not something that everybody can afford. And so it's another way to even kind of speak to that social hierarchy, um, that my main character can afford and has things that have dragon scales, and they have dragons in their home, whereas many of the other characters don't, because they wouldn't have been able to have that luxury.
And it's yeah, on the area of fashion, I also appreciate that you do as much as you do, have the fantastical elements, you do ground it in reality. And in specifics, you mentioned how in book one that the primary character believed that pockets were sensible and therefore essential. And so she had a dress made with pockets. Um, First off, this was actually a fairly recent revelation to me, which I didn't know was a thing, that a lot of women's clothes don't have pockets. But it's so funny because that is a common struggle with women's clothing, is you get this, nice dress, nice pants, whatever, but then they don't have pockets. And so it's fun how you introduce, yes, there's dragons and there's, how does that impact society? But then you also have the grounded reality of like, this is a woman living in society and struggling with real woman, challenges.
No, and it was interesting. So prior to the Regency era, women's dresses largely did have pockets, and because the skirt was usually separate from the top, and they would have these slits, and they would kind of almost, for lack of a better word, it was like a fanny pack that could put things in underneath the skirt. And then later they had pockets again, but the Regency era is famous for these very thin, very straight fabrics and kind of silhouettes. You have the high waist, and then it goes straight down. And they were very thin fabrics. Um, and so I was like, oh, well, but she has things she needs to carry. Like, she's a sensible person. It's ridiculous because they would have these little of almost satchels that they would carry around. I was like, well, but she has things to carry. So I kind of work around some of that in that she uses some charms, which is a form of magic, to conceal some of these things so the people doesn't know that her pocket is filled with whatever happens to be in it. In her assistant's case, it's generally snacks. But in her case, it might be weapons or something she needs for, she picks a lot of locks. So we have to keep those somewhere.
It's interesting to point that out of like of how fashion changes and one of the other things that you have happened a few times in book two is you have the characters dressing up as the opposite gender to try and blend in. So they dress up as men to go into certain circumstances. I don't want to go into too many details. I don't want to spoil anything. But one of the lines that you have in book two that I thought was really funny was talking about you don't have to worry when you're dressed as a gentleman about modesty when you're kicking someone in the face. And it really made me laugh. But what I liked about it was it kind of hinted to kind of this feminist perspective of in that time, and well, it's something that we even see today. Really, is there is this divide of what is appropriate for men to do and what's appropriate for women to do, and just because they look like a man, that they can suddenly do something that they couldn't before. And I liked that you touched on it several times throughout both books. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, because in their world, there was especially women of means. There were sets of rules they had to keep. And so sometimes she'll dress, so she is up the upper crust, so she's an heiress. So her class had actually a lot of social rules of where she could go, when she could go, who she could go with. So sometimes she'll dress below her class because it opens new places for her to be. She, as an heiress, couldn't walk into a tap room. She, as a maid, could. So she'll dress sometimes as a different class in order to open up that place for her. But also for men, it was also a safety thing sometimes. But also she couldn't get into a gambling hall, or she couldn't get into certain places dressed as a woman. And so, yeah, they would use a little theatrical makeup, a little bit of magic, and they would sneak into places in order to do whatever it is they need to do. And it's also practical. Like, it's much easier, as she says, to run or to kick people in pants than it is in a skirt. They do a lot of traipsing through the forest, and she would rather do it in a pair of pants and sensible shoes. Even though women had some pretty sensible shoes back then, still, she would rather throw on a pair of pants to go traipsing through the forest. And part of that comes with she also has had to adopt some different accents and to be able to carry out these roles pretty well. Part of the look I gave her as a character lent itself to that, so I purposely describe her as looking kind of like a pixie, and so she passes very well for like a 14, 15-year-old boy. And she likes to kind of take on that role often because it opens up doors to her that she as herself could not walk through. And yeah, I do touch on that quite a bit actually. Sometimes, yeah, she actually dresses up a lot. There's quite a few chapters where she doesn't look like herself.
Yeah, and I like that. It kind of reminded me of Sherlock Holmes was the thing that came to mind of he always had these elaborate costumes, and at multiple times he would show up and Watson wouldn't recognize him because his costume or makeup or outfit was that good. And that's kind of another parallel that I found throughout both book one and two. Was it kind of felt like a Regency fantasy Sherlock Holmesy kind of vibe. Yeah, what about mystery writing really interests you? Because like you say, you didn't necessarily want to do Regency because it's romance Regency, I should say. What about the mystery aspect was like, I really want to write this, or even to that question, was it a choice that you made, or was it something that came out of your writing as you were going?
No, it was definitely a choice. Wanting to lean into the mystery aspect was pretty early on. A lot of stories have mystery. If you think of most plots, there's a mystery element. But I wanted to go with the full blown mystery because one of my first thoughts was like that she could be a female sleuth, but how could she be a female sleuth in 1811? Women weren't really, women could work, but again, their fields were restricted. There was things they were allowed to do, governesses and maids, shopkeepers, things like that. Um, so I was like, what if she was a female sleuth, but only for women? So women would come to her with their problems. And so she does a lot of, looking into husbands, finding lost things, all of that. And so that was kind of the route it began to unfold. And that's even how the magical world began to unfold as I was looking into folk magic of England in that area. And there was actually quite a bit of it. And they would hire people to find things to help with, an illness. And they would give them all these things to do, and it was quite common back then, and they were called folk. That's what they were called, and that's what I call them in my novel. So that was actually a very common thing. So that all kind of came together. Like people, women in particular, had problems, and so who would they go to solve them? Well, probably would they be more comfortable with another woman. And so that's where she came in. That's why she has an assistant. She needed a Holmes, but also that assistant kind of poses sometimes as the public face of things and does a lot of the work with her and for her when she can't be somewhere. And so they kind of work together. They're very much a duo, each bringing their own set of skills to the table.
Yeah, I really liked the pairing because they play off each other really well. And there's several moments where the main character would be like, "Nah, don't do that. I know you're thinking about it, but don't do that." And then they end up doing it anyway. It's really fun. Yeah, play between the characters. I guess it sounds like you have a lot of knowledge about the Regency era and the timepiece aspect. Did you do a lot of research, or is this just kind of knowledge that you've gained over time from reading books and watching of that era?
A little bit. I have listened to, and I can't remember the names, some podcasts, but I do look into, there's so many people now who will have a YouTube channel on how women dressed in this era, or where they will talk about how people would address one another because there's titles, and the way you say a person's title really does matter. So I learned a lot from that. I try as best as I can to be historically accurate-ish, but I say in my on a page before you start reading, I say, things are different here. We're in a different timeline. We have dragons, kind of to say like, hey, if we don't get everything perfect, uh, it's a different world. So keep calm and carry on. Like, I'm not going to get everything perfect. This isn't a historical book. It's a nod to history. It's based in history, but it is not by any means historical. So there is a little wiggle room that's kind of nice to be able to play with.
One of the questions that I had based on that was you comment on that on the subject of sugar, only Americans and criminals add it to their cup before the tea has been poured. I'm not much of a coffee or tea drinker. Is that actually a thing?
Right. Yeah, no, no, you're supposed to add the tea. And then you're supposed to then add whatever it is you want to that because you need to taste it. Um, yeah, to put the sugar. Like I drink tea on like multiple times a day, and you brew it and then you add it in. And there's actually with like milk, you can't add milk during the brewing process because it can mess with the brewing process. So there, no tea is its own little world on itself. But yeah, no, you're supposed to always add it afterwards.
Fair enough. I should have guessed that there was that influence coming from your personal side with the teacups being part of the title in the first book. You mentioned that in the very early on you talk about the dragons to try and set the stage for what's to come. One of the things I thought you did interesting was you also included a form of what I would consider like content warnings. I liked how you did it though, where you didn't just like list out, okay, here's ABC thing that happens and you should be aware of it. You added a bit of flair to it, which I really liked. The question I had for you, what what led you to picking those things to highlight to say, these are the things that I want to warn people about? And I guess even before that question of what made you decide that you wanted to do a content warning at all?
Yeah, I think it's becoming more and more prevalent, and it's just out of a respect for people's experiences. I think we all have unique experiences and pasts, and some of us, I think when it was interesting when I became a mother, I used to before that be able to watch, for instance, like a Walking Dead. I cannot I cannot watch that kind of movie anymore. I have no idea why. I don't know what's changed, but before I could and now I can't. It literally, I just can't watch them anymore. So I thought it was just out of respect to the reader. They may have unique experiences, and I think sometimes walking in and knowing something is going to happen, yeah, can be very beneficial. We don't want to shock our readers. We don't want them to get two-thirds the way through our book and then throw in something that they feel offended by, makes them feel uncomfortable, brings up things they'd rather not think of. I mean, my story is cozy, so meaning a lot of those things, we aren't having things happen on the page generally, but there are references to those things, and I just want to give them a little nod and say, hey, if this really is something that you find especially uncomfortable, this might not be the book for you, or know it's coming so that it doesn't surprise you. I think it's just out of respect for them.
Yeah, that makes sense, and I did appreciate it. I thought it was helpful, and I guess it's worth noting, even though as I quoted, a scene where the main character is talking about kicking people in the face, I actually thought you handled the action slash violence aspect fairly well, and like I guess that kind of goes in line with the cozy aspect, where you didn't shy away from actionist events happening, but you didn't necessarily have to show, quote unquote, them the actual violence, which is something that it came up in my chat with Annie Bennett around she was writing crime novels, and it's a fairly common thing that people in crime novels go into like really gruesome detail when they are talking about the crimes that happen. I didn't find that in your book, which, as a self-professed wuss when it comes to these kinds of things, I appreciated. Yeah, I guess I guess you did touch on that, but yeah, I guess what was the thing that led you to go for cozy vibes instead of say gritty vibes or grounded vibes?
Yeah, I think for me, as I wanted it to be, I think both the Regency and fantasy is that there wants to be a little escapism. And so I wanted to also be able to escape some of the harsher realities of life in this. So even though we are talking about crime and there is fights and there are people getting hurt and there are all these things, to handle it in a way so that you could kind of know what's happening without needing to go into detail. And I think I admire that in certain filmmakers and certain authors is you can people's imaginations will put fill in the blank, and so you can say they they because well there's people murdered in this book, so they found a body, and so you can say that there was this, but you don't have to. It's a choice. Some people want that, and for I felt like it fit the tone of the narrator, the tone of the period, the tone of the overall story, to not go into depth, to not even there's one that happens in the second book that technically happens while being witnessed, but I do something where the character's vision cuts away for a second so they don't see the actual moment. And that's to maintain kind of that cozy vibe. So you know what happens. She's in the presence of the thing happening, but we have a quick moment where she doesn't actually see the second it happens. And that is just as a trying to maintain, I think, the story and the voice of the story. But also, I think I enjoy that kind of style of storytelling as well. The Alfred Hitchcock, uh, where we don't see what happens in the shower, and yet we know what happens in the shower. And I think that kind of storytelling can be a lot of fun.
Okay, cool. Yeah, no, I can dig that. And talking about book two, and I guess I'll caveat with If I go too much into spoiler territory, feel free to let me know to stop. But you do mention it fairly early on. Is the and I think it's even in the initial first pages of you talk about the temporal aspect of the second book, which you had me right off the bat with Memories, Magic, and Mayhem. I love temporal mysteries and stories where you're messing with time. That's really cool. What led you to go to the okay? Let's mess with time travel and time temporal aspects. And how do you keep track of that? Because you are manipulating not only writing a story, but then you have to keep track of timelines and potentially parallel timelines. I'm not going to comment with either way, but how do you keep track of
Sure.
that?
Yeah, I think, well, part of how I write a book is I have a spreadsheet and I plan out every chapter. And so even though there's some changes that happen within that, it's not super strict, but it gives me a good guide. And so I had to do a lot of thinking on this one because it is part of a series. And so in this, I really introduce things that are partially resolved and then fully resolved. So I had to keep track of this timeline and a long term timeline that is unfolding. So for me, I think just I love time travel books. Like I think I mentioned Jodi Taylor with Time Police. She also wrote St. Mary's, which those are time traveling historians. I'm a kind of a sucker for a time travel book, especially like when there's like a historical, like we are historians or something like that. That I really enjoy that. So I was thinking, how can I incorporate how can magic create an opportunity to travel through time? And at first, this wasn't my initial idea. It was something I came up between book one and book two. And I realized one of the gifts lent itself to opening a door for that, and was able to kind of follow that through. But then I had to create a system that made sense and that had its own rules and a reason why logically this could work. So that took a little bit of thinking. But once I had that down, um, the story came together pretty well. I had to decide on what theory of time I would use because there are theories of time. And so I had to decide this was the one I'm sticking with. This is the path I am going. And yeah, it came together pretty well. I think it makes sense within the universe. And that was the thing that was most important to me. Is I was like, if I introduce time travel, I want it to work within the rules I've begun to set up. And I want it to feel true to what could happen. I think I have opened a little bit of a Pandora's box with it, but it can be fun to see how it unfolds.
Indeed, yeah, and that's always my question going in, and we won't have to state it for spoiler's sake, but the question of what theory of time travel is this, which is always the fascinating part of it, of like trying to figure out what are the rules of time travel in this scenario, and if they go backwards in time or forwards in time, how does that affect other things? I'm down for all of that, which I really enjoy too the book. But I also liked how you say, and it shows up in the story, that even though you're creating fantastical things, you're including fantastical elements, you are also keeping it grounded and you are making it realistic that it would make sense. I think that's a really cool approach personally. I mean, like not no shame or shade on people who make stuff up and it doesn't make sense and you just kind of have to go along with it. But I appreciated that you put thought into I'm going to create a system that goes along with this magical thing I just invented. Um, yeah, like did you start with that being a primary key aspect, or was that kind of a development as you added magical elements? You're like, no, I really want to have them be grounded.
No, I think I actually started with them being grounded as I was looking into the magical, the folk magic of that era. I thought, oh, a lot of the main gifts, they're called gifts, I highlight are things that people would go to these folk healers or these people for. And so I was like, oh well, let's start there and then expand and kind of grow from there and make sure. again, that this world has its own rules and then it keeps those own rules. And that was something me and my editor actually had to go back and forth a lot on, because I realized I accidentally broke some of my own rules and then I had to fix them. So um, even between my beta and my final reading, there was the addition, particularly toward the end, where I realized, oh, I have to link this to this in this way because otherwise I break my own rules. And so I had to figure out ways to link everything so that the rules stay true. And that took a good deal of doing. And she also was like, "I'm confused by time travel. Explain it to me like I'm 5." And so I had a lot of that. I was like, "Okay." So I was very. That was a lot of our editing process. Was going back and like dropping little explanations. That's where there's one character, her uncle, who's kind of a mad genius, and he comes in really handy for explaining things because he kind of has his feet in all of this scientific ideas and thoughts, and so he's a great person to be able to work through some of that with, and he helps a lot with explanation without it seeming like explanation. It's just breakfast, and they're discussing time travel. So
Like that. Yeah, and I guess the next question I have for you is, so you're talking about, grounding in reality. You are writing in the past, so the Regency era. Um, some of the things that you talk about back then do seem to correlate or have parallels to what's happening today. How do you keep that consistent, or like what's the choice there of like, do you want to have influences of today's verbiage or today's problems that women are facing in that era, or are you pulling that forward and saying this is how it was, and then as readers we're looking backwards and kind of learning from it?
I think a little bit of both. I think that era was an interesting pivot point. We're coming. You had some of the early, what we would call, go on to call like feminists emerging at that point. We think obviously of Jane Austen, whose people don't always think of as a feminist, but she really discussed a lot of issues around women not being able to earn their own money, and how hard that was. But you have Wollstonecraft. She's writing at the time. Shelley is shortly after. And then you're going to get into the Brontes, and then the world kind of opens to female authors in this century, and so they are discussing these issues. I love Wollstonecraft. Some of her quotes are, gosh, just amazing. Here we are, 200 plus years later, and she is just spot on again and again. So I think that there was that emerging that was taking place, and these questions of, well, why can't we, and why should we? Um, and we're still sometimes, I think, asking and answering those questions today. So I felt that those are good things to bring forward. Her wealth enabled her to maybe ask some of those questions where other women couldn't. But because she had wealth, she was a little bit more free to challenge some of these things. And that was one thing that is a privilege that she has. Whereas, her assistant and some others don't have that privilege. So, yeah, I think what's happening today definitely informed it and things that are important to me. But also, those were questions that they were wrestling with at that time. The idea of even romantic love and marrying for romantic love, that was a fairly new concept that they were going from you marry for financial, familial ties only to, well, you could marry if you love somebody. Maybe. Um, so that was even happening right around then.
Hmm. That's interesting. Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that because it came up in with my chat with Annie Bennett, where she actually wrote a dissertation on Jane Austen, and one of the key themes being about the feministic side or the feminism side of Jane Austen. I feel like I have to go back and read through and watch those movies again because um, I didn't pick that up as like that wasn't the thing that I got. I mean, obviously, I'm speaking from a male perspective, but I think for me it would be important to go back and watch through and see those those elements come through it. which as a male reader, I did pick up on the, there's some elements that you portray that are that pro feminism side, which I actually appreciated because I feel like I feel like today we need more stories that highlight strong female characters, but then also show that there's, a range of female characters. It's not just all, a single role that a woman can play in any given story. So I appreciated that you tackled that, and what I thought was a pretty good approach to that.
One thing about my characters is they're mostly women, and I feel like the spectrum of what we would call feminine or within it. And so you have a Miss Stevenson who's very, what we would call kind of typical. She likes the lace and she likes, the way I describe her anyway, is very curvaceous and just kind of like this is this typical. But then you have like Walt, who, by the fact that she goes by the name Walt, says something and she smokes a pipe, and she would be more comfortable in pants. And I think if she were alive today, she would probably, um, really feel comfortable and would be a part of the LGBTQIA community. Um, it's kind of funny because I don't even know. She kind of almost feels like this separate entity that has her own personality, her own life. But I picture her today in that world, unapologetically wearing pants all the time, because that would just be who she is. Just really, what was hard is was she was living in 1811, and in 1811 there were societal norms that she had to stick within, and she had to wear pants, and she had to have long hair, and she had to do these things because that's what you had to do if you were a woman in that era. And she does push against that as much. She often elbows it, her pipe smoking, and when she's at home, she's actually wearing a man's robe, and she tries to dress up as a man as often as she can because she just finds it more comfortable. And I think she did what she could in 1811 in that era. But I would be curious to see who she would be today. Part of me knows, but part of me also kind of thinks like, I wonder who or what Walt would be, and where she would live, and how she would express herself. It would be really curious, but I think she did the best she could for that area. But
Indeed, yeah, and I did pick up on that vibe, but it's just as you say, it's this character's, experience, and they've kind of taken a life of their own. And I remember that came up when I talked to Sean Turman about how, yeah, he technically started writing the story, but then after a certain point, he became like an observer, and then the characters kind of did their own thing, and he was just taking notes as he was watching to see what they did. So it's interesting to hear that it sounds like you have a similar aspect with like Walt and some of the other characters.
I think had she be given another choice, her life would have been very different. And she kind of works within what she can do because there are social constraints. And I think people have always had to do that. Is that wherever you live and whenever you live, um, you work within what you can do with what you have been given, and that's what she could do then. And so, yeah, I think in this last book, she says, "Can we enlist yet? Like, why can't I enlist? Like, when can we get pants? And when can we vote?" And so that's what she would like, and those are some of the things she would like to do because she doesn't see why she has to run around in skirts and have pin cushions, and all of these things.
Indeed, yeah, and it's something I've noticed watching as you post on Threads. You mention um, the concept of, but what can you do? I've seen that you've really picked up on certain themes, what's going on in the world, and you want to find a way to do something about it. So there's like the recent Substack that you started, some of the people that you're talking to, and kind of the vibe that you're putting out of. It really seems that there, is an element of you want to do something about what's going on, and I feel like your stories is a part of it. But yeah, can you talk a bit about that from your perspective?
Sure. No, I mean, my background, as I said, was news and then nonprofit work. And that work really gave me a perspective outside of my own, um, and taught me to be a person who, even if something is not my experience, that I can give space to listen to you and to trust you are telling me the truth of your experience. And then I need to incorporate that into my view of the world and see if I can then support you, or just sometimes stand beside you. Like I don't need to fix. That was one thing I had to learn in nonprofit work. My job is often not to fix things. Oftentimes my job is just to stand alongside people and say, I hear you, I see you, I trust you, and can I help, or can I just maybe just be encouraging to you in some small way. But even in my novels, yes, I think in literature, so often the seeds of revolution and change are sown. Because in novels and in characters, we have the ability to develop empathy and see a perspective outside of our own. I think so many classic novels that have shaped and changed the way I see things. And so in this and in my own storytelling, wanting to give a place to show women who are women, because most of my characters are women. I have a few men, and most of the times they're the villains. But I I wanted to show strong women who have their own agency, and it's very different. You know, they each have their own path, um, but that that they can save the day, that they can be the heroes, that they can have men who are allies, but at the end of the day, the person who is saving the day is going to, not spoilers, but also spoilers, is going to be one of the women. And so, because I just think we need those stories too. There can be a breadth of stories, and this was the story I felt like I needed to write, was, you know, to give us that encouragement and that hope. So,
I like that. I really like that, and I can empathize with that position, or with what you're saying, in that, as a Canadian, watching what's going on in the States, I feel a lot of that where, I want to do something, but as you say, sometimes the doing is just, standing beside people or encouraging people or being there to listen to people's stories. So I appreciate what you've been doing on Threads, and I also appreciate that you're writing these female leads as primary characters, and that this is the center of the stories around all these women and their stories. It's definitely something that I feel like, as a man, I am trying to broaden my perspective, because like a lot of the books I read tend to have male, main characters, and the hero of the day tends to be a man, and the villains could be women, but usually tend to be men. So it's like, yeah, it seems to be a lot of male driven everything. So it's really refreshing to read a story where there's men in the story. And there's certain characters, like you mentioned, the relatives, that do play a part, but you know, that the women didn't need necessarily to have the men in order to save the day. I thought that was a really important message that I hope that other people do as well.
yeah, I think we need those stories. I love a story. Um, I love a story where I love heroes, and so whoever the hero. But I think I didn't want to be the story where the woman does a lot of the work, and at the end, some guy rushes in and is the Prince Charming. And not that that's bad. You know what? Sometimes we need those stories, and I read those stories and I enjoy them. And there's nothing wrong, but I think there needs to also be a space where um, it is unapologetically the women who are saving the day, and who have men who support them and help them. But the ones leading the final charge are going to be the women. And I think that that's okay too. We need space for all of those stories, because all of those stories exist in our world. And so we can't just have one kind of story. All of those things happen for us. So we need place for all of those.
What would you say is something that you've written for quite some time now? What would you say is some advice that you could give to either fellow authors who do have published books or writers who haven't quite yet gotten to that point or are working on their writing? Yeah, what piece of advice would you want to share to such a person?
I think, first of all, is learn about writing great characters. There's a few books out there, and there's many that are just really good about creating a character arc. Because so often I think we get caught up in letting the action drive the story, and not that that's bad. There can be a place for that, but what makes stories is great characters. Um, and so finding out and studying how to write great characters, and that was something I really worked toward, was making them all very unique, both in their personality and their experiences, but also even their appearances. That was a tip my editor gave me, is that almost all of my characters have a very distinct feature to them that helps you remember them so that you don't confuse them, but also those features lend itself to telling you about who they are as people. So for instance, her aunt always wears black, and is very kind of hard. Her uncle is kind of mad scientist, and his clothes are constantly wrinkled. They don't, despite the best efforts of the staff in his house, they cannot keep them unwrinkled. Walt smokes a pipe. She calls herself Walt. She always has snacks whenever she can. She is in pants or in a robe. Like, again, that speaks to who she is. And it says something about her personality. And so I think that those are very important things. My editor really helped me. She said, I keep confusing these two people, or I keep confusing some of your characters. How can we describe them in ways that make them very clear as individuals? And I think even Penelope, my main character, she kind of looks like a pixie, which pixies are a little ornery and a little mischievous. And so even though she looks like this heiress, really, there's a lot of kind of mischievousness happening beneath the surface. So I think that is the characters. And then, some people love to just kind of free for all write. Some people like to plan. Some people are right in between. I don't think that's something you can really say, but I do think sometimes my other thing would be to give yourself a deadline. And I know that people don't love deadlines, but I work really well with deadlines, because if you announce to the world, I am publishing this on this day, then boy, you better get that done. So, yeah, you got to do it. So, I announce my publishing dates pretty far in advance, and I have been able to keep them thus far because I'm like, no, I have to get this done. So I work so hard on that. But I think that helps too, is a publishing date. Or even if not a publishing date, a date you want to get it into the hands of someone to read, to give their opinion on. That can help a lot too.
Yeah, I can definitely echo that. Um, yeah, and I guess on that note, can you? Well, book two is at the point of recording this is coming out shortly. I think when this releases, it'll be out for a bit. Um, can you talk at all about? You said at one point that there's a part of a series. Do you have a greater plan that you're able to talk about for this book series?
Yeah, so there's a total of 4 within this character arc. So it's not that these characters might not come up in other things, but this set. We have 4, so we'll be 2 in. 3, I'm probably looking at a November with a standalone spinoff coming maybe September. So I'm kind of considering launching them, like pre-writing them um, throughout this spring and into the summer, and then releasing them boom boom. So the third book will follow one of the characters. Each book kind of highlights one of the 4 main characters. And so book 3 will highlight the next main character on the list. The third one will follow one of the 3 main characters. But in between, I'm kind of thinking of putting a spin-off. It's going to be a different way of storytelling. So we have a character who's a Yeti. I'm thinking of doing something that stays within the world and stays within a couple of the characters. Some of the side characters will be brought a little bit more to the forefront. um, doing something that kind of reminds you almost of a Village styles. If you've heard of the movie The Village, M. Night Shyamalan, kind of a little bit of a, I don't even know the word for it. I almost want to say dark fantasy, but it's not really dark because I don't. It's not going to be too scary, but kind of scary, a little bit more scary, kind of scary. And follows one of the side characters, Mr. Scott, who is a Yeti. Um, so kind of a standalone there. And I intend to actually draw a lot of fun different elements in, like putting newspaper clippings as part of the storytelling, diary entries, stolen letters, and just sliding those into this book and those be part of the storytelling. So that one. So we'll see if I will know soon whether I can make the September work. But definitely by the fall, because that one will be released sometime in the fall because it's a winter kind of theme story. So
Awesome. Is there anything else that you want to talk about as far as like the upcoming book or anything else that you're working on that you wish that people would know about you or what's going on in your world?
no, I think I'm just excited to. It's just been a joy to be able to do this. It's been something I've dreamed of for many years, and so it's kind of enjoyable to be here and to be able to a place where I can write stories and enjoy doing so, and really loving it. Using, I think, this piece of myself that I used just for like newsletters and writing stories for articles that were fine, but I think being able to tell stories has been a way to express a part of myself that I always had there, but I was never able to do something with. So I'm really glad to be in this phase and excited to see where it takes me. It's scary. Sometimes it feels like on the roller coaster, you know, we're at the top of the hill. That's where it feels like half the time. Like I'm just holding on, like white knuckling, like, I don't know how to do this. um, and making a lot of mistakes along the way and learning a lot from the journey, but really growing in that. So, yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah, and I'm excited for you. This is yeah, book two coming out. At the time of this recording, it's coming out shortly. Um, yeah, where can people find you on socials? What's the best way to connect with you?
Sure. So almost all of the main platforms, I'm mostly on Threads. It's the one where I enjoy being on the most. But I'm also on Blue Sky a little. I am on Substack. I am on Tome now, figuring that out, seeing how I feel about that one. Occasionally dabble in TikTok, but not so much very often. But in all of them, it is author Kay Starling. And that is also my website, authorkaystarling.com. So I was able, thankfully, to get all of the socials with the same name, so there's no confusion. I'm easy to find in all those places. And my books are on Amazon, and probably by the time this recording comes out, they should be on Kobo, on Barnes and Noble, and also just most online retailers because I use Ingram Spark, which that distributes to a lot of, you know, even your local bookshop likely orders through Ingram Spark. And so you can often order a book through there if you want to. So that's a great way to support indie authors, is that you could often order through them too. And internationally, even like if you are over in Germany, you can probably find my book on an online retailer. No, it's only in English. I do not have the money to interpret it into German, but there we go.
That's awesome. Well, yeah, it's been a pleasure to have you on here, and I really enjoyed reading both the books. I hope that people check them both out. I'll include the links that you mentioned in some other ones as well, so people can check that out. Yeah, I just appreciate you taking the time, and good luck on your book launch.
Thank you. Thank you so much.